In the 1940s, renowned Canadian author Farley Mowat spent a few years traveling with a small group of Inuit in the Canadian Arctic Barrens. In 1952, he published a book called People of the Deer, outlining his experiences of this time. This book was debated in the Canadian Parliament, with ministers calling Mowat a liar for his depiction of famine, epidemics, and forced relocation of Inuit, which caused unimaginable hardship and trauma to a once prosperous people. However, Mowat was right. The book is now validated as a wake-up call for Northern activism, as we uncover more injustices that happened in the Canadian North. I was reminded of a quote from the book, outlining Mowat's observation of the raw natural beauty of this unforgiving landscape. Mowat poignantly notes that there is no word for beauty in the Inuit dialect of the people he traveled with, and that it needs no words in their hearts. The other thing I remember from this book is his recount of the maddening amount of mosquitoes and black flies in the summer, with blood-crusted clothing having to be cut away from the body due to so many bites. That kind of thing sticks with you too. Hello, I am Unsettled. I'm a researcher who likes to learn more about things that unsettle me. Here we do deep dives into unsettling topics with a social justice angle. So please, if this sounds like your cup of tea, please like and subscribe. I also have short form videos on TikTok as well as Twitter. My handle is @UnsettledEdu. Thank you very much. So this video is about dogs.
Dogs. What?
Yeah, dogs.
And it's also about a lot of other things. It was really hard to make because, like many interesting stories, it was really complicated. So let's dive in. The first thing I want to draw your attention to is the Arctic. It's cold, it's big, and from these shots, it's also very, very pretty. So the Canadian Arctic is about 40% of Canada's landmass and 72% of Canada's coastline because of all the little islands up there. And there are also lots of people that live there. Not as many people as in the rest of Canada, but they're there. And those people have a lot of stories. More and more ugly histories have been coming to light in general. Mostly because we have more information that we can look at through the internet, and newer generations seemingly are becoming more concerned with social justice issues. And in Canada, a lot of this awakening has to do with our history regarding Indigenous peoples.
Are you sure it's the white man who did all that stuff? Because I come from white people, and this is the first time hearing of it.
Yes, I am sure.
Wow.
Yes, wow.
You've probably guessed we're going to be talking about a lot of upsetting things today, so I'll let you know when we're really getting into it. The big trigger is going to be animal abuse, but I'll be careful not to show anything violent on screen. And one more disclaimer. There are a lot of words in my script that are in Inuktitut. I don't speak Inuktitut. Mostly the words will be like people and place names, so bear with me. I am just a silly little white girl.
The people.
There's been a lot of discussion about what it means to be Indigenous, but as defined in the Canadian Constitution, there are 3 general categories of Indigenous peoples in Canada: First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. Inuit are the people of the Arctic region. There are about 60,000 people living in about 51 communities in the Arctic, most of them being Inuit, and even more Inuit still living outside of the Inuit homeland in the rest of Canada. Some well-known Inuit in pop culture include Susan Glukark, a Juno Award-winning musician, Jordan Tutu, a professional hockey player, and yes, his number was 20. "60% of Inuit still speak Inuktitut, one of the principal Inuit languages in Canada, and many still rely on a mixed food system, which means harvesting food from the land, such as seal, narwhal, caribou, fish, berries, etc., in addition to buying food from the store. However, Many of these Arctic communities experience a lot of struggling and hardship, experiencing higher than average rates of food insecurity, housing insecurity, poverty, and other health and social issues when compared to Canada as a whole. A lot of these social issues and trauma directly stem from the impact of colonialism on Inuit.
Find yourself traveling among northern lights. Cold winds howl, hear the sled dogs cry.
The relationship between dogs and humans is really old and pretty special. Wolves were domesticated thousands of years ago, being the first animals to be domesticated by humans and the only one domesticated before the agricultural revolution. It's not hard to see this bond still going strong between dogs and their humans today.
I've only had Arlo for a day and a half, but if anything happened to him, I would kill everyone in this room and then myself.
Sled dogs consist of a handful of specific breeds of Arctic dogs domesticated in the region, from Alaska, the Canadian Arctic, to Greenland, Scandinavia, and Siberia.
His name is Grim and he lives on Svalbard, an island close to the North Pole. Come along with him to his frosty backyard. His fluff will warm your soul.
You're probably familiar with sled dogs from a lot of different pop culture.
From a world of incredible spectacle, at the edge of the Alaskan frontier.
His pupils thought out by what's need to be.
Yvonne claimed the land for his country's glory, and that's the start of Yvonne's story. Yvonne of the Yukon.
Defrosted for you and for me.
Jump! Jump! Land! Land! Thank you, boob lady!
There are mainly 4 North American Arctic dog breeds: the Siberian Husky, the Samoyed, the Malamute, and the Canadian Inuit dog. We'll be specifically looking at the latter breed for this video. Canadian Inuit dogs are considered to be a pretty rare breed. They are very good dogs. They're called Qimmiq in Inuktitut. Qimmiq is the singular and Qimmiq is the plural. And they are the official animal of Nunavut, which is one of the territories of Canada. Qimmiq are built for their environment. They are powerful, athletic, and robust, and meant for hard work. They have a very dense and thick coat, with a mane of thick fur around their neck, and their coat can be a range of different colors and shades. Qimmiq are known for being affectionate and loyal, developing a deep bond with their humans. They thrive in the cold, and they prefer to sleep outside in the wintertime. They're prone to heat stroke, so they need to live in a cold climate like the Arctic to be comfortable. Qimmiq need a large amount of exercise. Just the standard walk isn't sufficient. They need high-intensity work. The relationship between Qimmiq and Inuit is intense, in both a practical and a spiritual sense. Living solely off the land is one thing, but living off the land in the Arctic is something completely different. Dogs have always been traditionally essential to Inuit for hunting, scouting, traveling. They pulled the sleds in the winter. They carried packs in the summer. They've also been said to haul home big catches of fish. Dogs help hunt big game like muskox and caribou on the land and seal and polar bear on the ice. They enabled Inuit to sell furs to participate in the wage economy, allowing for purchase of goods like bullets, flour, tea, and tobacco. To hear Inuit speak of the capabilities of Qimmiq, it almost makes them sound supernatural. The dogs can sniff out seal breathing holes on the ice. They can alert people to danger. They keep the polar bears away, allowing families to sleep safely at night.
We were able to spend a good night's rest in an igloo without worrying about dangerous wildlife approaching our camp. Those dogs were the best lifeguards.
They have an innate sense of navigation, even in whiteout conditions.
Even during a blizzard, the dogs would reach the master's desired destination without losing their way. We didn't need search and rescue for lost hunters because no one got lost. It was good to trust, to know the dogs would see me through in whatever situation.
For this video, along with heaps of reports, peer-reviewed literature, and news articles, I've also consulted a couple of documentaries, so I'm just explaining where these clips are coming from now. The first video is called Echo of the Last Howl. It's a film made in 2005 by an Inuit organization called Qikiqtani. The second is called Qimmiq, A Clash of Two Truths. It was made in 2010 by Joelle Sangua and Ollie Gerstad. I like these films a lot because they've got some really good interviews with Inuit about the topic of today's video, so I highly recommend that you check them out for further detail if you're interested.
This is a story I waited a long time to tell you, little Mary. A story I'll tell you today in solemn appropriation as a rite of passage. I will tell you what the men did. I will tell you the price we paid in our history, in our community.
Dogs were always an integral part of Inuit life until about the 1950s. You see, settled permanent Inuit communities are actually a very recent thing. Inuit have always been semi-nomadic, living in tightly knit kinship groups on the land, with mobility being a big part of the culture. Inuit Nunangat is the Inuit homeland, and Inuit moved around this territory by a dog team and by boat, in pursuit of the wildlife that supplied most of their food, clothing, and shelter. Inuit followed their familiar hunting routes and reoccupied the same sites for generations. They followed a seasonal cycle of harvesting, dictated by weather conditions, animal migrations, and cultural linkages. Even after colonization was well underway in the south, interactions with government officials and police were fewer in the Arctic, while Inuit were still living this semi-nomadic lifestyle. However, during the mid-20th century, a new way of life arrived, very quickly, and with those changes came whispers of a massacre. Decades later, elders would remember Mounties coming in and shooting their dogs, but officials would deny this. So what actually happened? To explore this question, we need to take a look at Inuit Nunangat between 1950 and 1970. These 2 decades were when the most changes happened in the Arctic, when Inuit quickly transitioned from their traditional, semi-nomadic ways of life and moved into the 51 settled communities that we see today. Thousands and thousands of years of a traditional way of life changed drastically in the span of only about 20 years. What drove this fast change? The Canadian government had a plan. They wanted to assimilate those living in the Arctic to a similar way of life lived in the rest of Canada. They wanted to educate Inuit children in a Western system. They wanted to provide medical treatment in a Western way and distribute social assistance such as family allowances, welfare, and old age pensions. Some Inuit moved to these settlements voluntarily due to promises of employment, healthcare, or low-rent housing, but others moved to avoid being separated from their children who were forced to attend school, or to join family members who had already moved. More still moved because they felt coerced, or forced to relocate by government authorities. I'm actually working on a companion video to this one talking about the high Arctic relocation, and more broadly, Inuit relocation in general. So I'll be delving into that topic in more detail in the next video, so keep an eye out for this later on.
This is John. This is Mary. This is John.
In the 1960s, people are starting to think that Inuit are going to become more or less like we. That they're going to, in fact, end up with wage employment. They're going to buy their groceries in the store. They're going to get up at 8:30 in the morning and go off to work with a lunch bucket in hand. And the women are going to stay home and bake scones and clean the house and do the sewing and so forth and so on. So the attitude towards dogs changes.
As you can imagine, it was not an easy decision to give up a traditional way of life. Once the decision was made, it was generally irreversible. We'll discuss why later in this video. Regardless of if they moved voluntarily or not, Inuit found that promises of a better life in these settled communities were not kept, and felt that their lives were actually made worse, not better, by the move. Settled life imposed a new form of poverty, with a lack of access to the land hindering the ability to obtain the country food that nourished their minds, bodies, and souls.
Frank Tester's documents tell us about the time of big changes in Nunavut. Life in traditional camps and life in the new settlements were 2 different things.
Well, it's a tangled story. They tell us that, essentially what happened is dogs were an asset. They were essential. You couldn't eat without dogs. You couldn't seal hunt without dogs. You couldn't travel without dogs. Dogs were probably one of the most important aspects of Inuit culture in the period before the 1960s. So the move into settlements takes place, and dogs become a liability in the eyes of Kaluna. I'm talking about the way in which the white folks living in these new settlements that we're developing started to see and understand dogs.
Life becoming more settled in Inuit communities coincided with more policing. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or the RCMP, is Canada's national police force, and they're the main policing presence in most regions of the Arctic at this time. The relationship between Inuit and the RCMP kind of paralleled the experiences of RCMP with other Indigenous peoples. They were promising at the start, but then they deteriorated. Tensions were aggravated by an imbalance of power, racism, and poor intercultural communications. As highlighted in a report by the Qikiqtani Truth Commission, for a century, the RCMP have been victimizing Native people. Predictably, little attention was paid to the plight of the Native people who fell victim to the harsh brutality of the RCMP racism. The public can remain oblivious to the Native suffering for 100 years, but let the word get out that a few telephones have been tapped, and a few offices broken into by the RCMP, and the public is incensed. Suddenly, the public feels the RCMP is out of control. To tens of thousands of Canada's Native people, it has never been any other way.
Look, I hate cops!
The RCMP began postings in the Arctic in the 1920s, starting out with a minimal presence of annual patrols and providing some medical services. But again, as highlighted in the QTC report, the RCMP did not bring policing or justice to the Arctic. It was already there. Since time immemorial, Inuit have had their own means of exercising justice and encouraging social cohesion. As described by Inuit, interdependence with the natural world and with each other necessitated certain strong but largely psychological means of influencing behavior to ensure survival and happiness. Inuit were cautious and respectful of nature. Trusted wisdom from previous generations was a framework for Inuit actions and rationales, with control and leadership localized in a kinship-based community. Around this time, the Canadian government conducted extensive aerial mapping and mineral resource surveys that covered most of the Arctic, including planning economic development, especially exploitation of minerals, oils, and gas. This new interest in the Arctic led to more interest in the people living there. Government agents saw the Arctic as isolated, underdeveloped, and problematic, that required intervention to incorporate into the rest of Canada. By the 1950s, the RCMP Arctic presence was more permanent. The message sent to Inuit was clear. These police were the messengers and enforcers of the government. So who were these officers? Generally, they were police who met the education and physical requirements, who had a drive to have adventure in the north. These were young men, and all RCMP officers in the Arctic prior to 1975 were men, who didn't want to miss out on this exciting phase of being on the force, the frontier of the Arctic. These officers were transient, rarely staying longer than 1 or 2 postings, thus making it hard to build a meaningful relationship with the people they were policing. On the other side, Inuit found the police to be unpredictable and inconsistent. Some officers were respectful and reasonable, while others were racist and abusive.
They started shooting dogs in the 50s, and they shot quite a few. And whether dogs were shot would depend on the RCMP officer and the bylaws that were in place at the time. And some RCMP officers were not inclined to shoot dogs because they had a better appreciation than other RCMP officers of the importance of dogs to Inuit. Others didn't have that kind of insight, didn't have those kinds of relationships, and they were, I guess you could call them, trigger happy.
This meant that policies were enforced unpredictably, depending on the officer. Remember, people change postings a lot, so one action might be ignored by one officer or be deemed an offense by another. By and large, most RCMP officers seem to have little to no interest in learning about Inuit culture, but despite all this, Inuit were expected to help care for the RCMP, in spite of the challenges they were already facing. Remember, this is the Arctic. It's not exactly a forgiving environment to live in, and RCMP were expected to patrol both settled communities and out on the land. They relied on Inuit as guides and to provide them with basic needs. This isn't a small feat when you consider Inuit were already providing for themselves and their own families. A quote from Elijah Penepakuchu in a QTC report states, "Without the help of Inuit, RCMP would not have survived. They would have been dead. They tell stories of being heroic, but they had to be housed, clothed, fed. It was like looking after a 5 or 6-year-old. They would start suffering immediately when they were alone. Those Inuit really had a hard time. They had to look after themselves and the RCMP. RCMP were not only reliant on Inuit, but also on Qimmiq. So now, we have Inuit being pushed into settled communities and a settled way of life, and RCMP officers stationed in these communities to enforce laws made thousands of miles away in a completely different context by people who didn't understand what it was like to live in the north and had little to no experience living in the Arctic or among the Inuit. Great, that makes sense. How could this go wrong? In a lot of government policy and RCMP documentation, most officials did seem to believe that they were acting in the best interests of the Inuit. Essentially, that forcing them to assimilate was beneficial to them. However, we can see that this policing and enforcement of colonial laws and policies were only in the best interests of the RCMP and the Canadian government. Forcing people to settle in permanent communities was convenient for the goal of assimilation. These sites were mostly chosen by government agencies, forcing and coercing Inuit into settlements built at existing trading posts. These policies tried to essentially hammer Inuit into a colonized lifestyle not conducive to the traditional way they had lived since time immemorial. I'm not going to delve into schooling too much for the sake of brevity. It's a huge topic on its own, but by now most people have at least heard of the atrocities of residential schools in Canada. These schools existed in the Arctic as well, which essentially dismantled the whole way of living and bringing up children. Inuit children learn skills out on the land, so you can see how forcing all these kids into a Western-style schooling system could all but annihilate traditional culture. But again, I can't get into this right now. The government, and the RCMP by proxy, made Inuit a lot of false promises. The police were supposed to keep these northern communities safe. They enforced policies set out by the Canadian government, made by people who were trying to force Inuit into a settled lifestyle. So how did the dogs come back into this? Well, Inuit traditionally wouldn't tie up their dogs. The dogs would roam free when they weren't actively harnessed up to sleds. Non-Inuit people living in Arctic communities, white people, were not used to dogs roaming around, leading bureaucrats in Ottawa to address this concern by instating a dog ordinance, which was enforced by the RCMP. We'll talk about the details of that later.
And the dogs are loose, and people had to learn how to deal with loose dogs within the community. They're hungry.
Out on the land, when the dogs weren't working, they ran free. They stayed close to their family. They scrounged food from scraps. The law about tying up the dogs when they came into the settlement was something new.
Were the dogs dangerous? We'll talk about that later too. But first, more on the police. The police, being agents of the government and enforcers of the law, led to a pretty big power imbalance, as you can imagine. RCMP could dictate to Inuit where to go, what to hunt, and how to behave. They didn't consult Inuit when deciding or implementing their plans, and many Inuit didn't understand why these laws were being imposed on them.
Those days, the Hadlunat were very unapproachable and even scary to the Inuit. That's why the Inuit didn't do or say anything to stop them, or even voice their concern.
Remember, in addition to the language barrier, RCMP didn't speak Inuktitut and many Inuit didn't speak English. These changes in policy making all happened really, really fast. This led to a lot of repercussions, some intended and some not. As reported by the QTC, government agencies responsible for this abrupt transformation Primarily, Indian and Northern Affairs Canada and the RCMP are still not fully aware of their own history in the Arctic or the effects of their decisions and actions. The RCMP were authority figures. A lot of Inuit described them as intimidating. They feared arrest for not complying with police orders.
The first time I saw that policeman, his face was stern and looked intimidating.
Some more context from a QTC report. In many cases, individual officers may not have been aware that Inuit were unhappy, angry, or confused. That is because of Ilira, the Inuktitut term to describe a sense of fear, intimidation, and embarrassment. In customary context, Ilira was a positive method of social control, but in relationships between RCMP and Inuit, the feeling of Ilira stopped Inuit from speaking out against injustices. The police were the most intimidating of all Kalunat, white people, with which they came into contact. If Inuit failed to listen to RCMP or didn't adequately understand the police, they could be taken away and imprisoned.
There was a lot of misunderstanding. If I was the area administrator and told you you are Inuk, tie up your dogs or else I'll shoot them. The Inuk would say, although he doesn't understand, so he didn't tie him up because he didn't understand what the white man was saying, you know. He didn't want to show. He wanted to show that he understand what the white man was saying to him, you know.
So a lot of lapses in cross-cultural communication happening here. A quote from John Amogoalik, an Inuk from Inukjuak, describes this power imbalance as follows. I think it's also important for people to understand that when the RCMP made a request to you in those days, it was seen as something like an order. You're ordered to do this. The RCMP officers had a lot of power. They could put you in jail. That's the way they were viewed in those days. A request from the police was taken very, very seriously. A similar quote from Moses Qikiqtani reads, "The RCMP used to mistreat us badly in those days when they considered themselves superior to Inuit. The RCMP considered Inuit as though we meant nothing in their eyes. And these power imbalances went to places that you would be afraid that they would go. A lot of RCMP had sexual relationships with Inuit women. Now, some of these relationships were consensual and led to loving marriages, but some were coercive. Probably a lot of them were coercive. As stated in a QTC report, in numerous places, RCMP had sexual relationships with Inuit women that resulted in both anguish for the women and lingering hurt for the children who never met their fathers and were physically different than others in their community. Here's a comic from an RCMP periodical that seems to make fun of this. As stated by Julie Papazzi, with that much power, they could do anything they wanted to do. The RCMP could do anything they wanted with any woman that was living up north. Anything. Now that woman who was forced sexually by this officer cannot talk back, has nowhere to go and complain. Her husband knows but cannot do anything, is powerless. Some Inuit told the QTC about their experiences as children of Inuit women and white police officers. Elisa Piutuva told the QTC, "I have an RCMP father. I'm different from my sister. I'm an illegitimate child, and it's embarrassing. I was so close with my non-biological father, and when I started learning that I have a white father, when I started getting older, I was very agitated by it." So I came across all this in my research, and I decided to include it to really try and depict the dynamic between RCMP and Inuit at this time. So when we start talking about this next bit, keep it in mind. Now, after ample time spent on context, we get to the main topic of this video. Content warning, this is where it gets more graphic. Again, graphic in terms of descriptions, not graphic visuals.
The beginning of the slaughter seemed as if the RCMP did it. There was a policeman stationed in Inukjuak, but none anywhere else close to here. It seemed the RCMP gave it their all, but they were only following orders from the government. They took their job seriously, killing loose dogs. They had the authority to appoint other Caucasians in other villages to kill loose dogs. When these RCMP wanted something done, we had no choice but to obey. They appointed any available Caucasian, whether it be a store manager or whoever was available, to shoot any loose dogs, because the government wanted that. They didn't see the damage they did to our livelihood.
And a lot of dogs were out on the bay for the slaughter. I heard the first shots, and the dogs started howling until they got shot. I witnessed the burning of the dogs after the slaughter. It was a horrible scene, and I didn't like seeing it. On top of that, the mere presence of that policeman was intimidating and even scary. Every time I saw a policeman, they affected me that way. The policeman was rough on the dogs. Sometimes his shot didn't kill the dog, and they would run away with a hole in the stomach or elsewhere. What an experience.
During the dog slaughter, the white man just went about it without any regard for the Inuit. I'm not saying it was all white men, but the police who were in the village at the time just went and slaughtered the dogs without preamble or forewarning. There was a huge pile of dead dogs, shaped like a pyramid, on the ice to be burned.
The dogs, one after the other, were heaped in a pile, a tower of death. The police, pleased to be efficient, hurried to set them on fire. There were some of us who helped. This horrible cremation haunts me with bitter memories. Yet many have forgotten that they were savagely deprived of their identity, of their freedom.
We even led the dogs to the slaughter site because the slayers requested it. The dogs were used to us and went willingly. We put up a brave front, but our minds were seething with rage. It was heartrending and thoroughly depressing. For sure, some people didn't sleep well that night, thinking about their deprivation. We hid our regret. I don't remember too well after that, but the slaughter was a first of its kind, and it was a painful experience. I felt like I was handing over my life when I led the dogs out to the bay. Seeing them for the last time, when they were so trusting, going about the way they usually do, leading them with the leash to the slaughter site, I felt for my dogs. I think all the other victims felt the same way too, like they were handing over a part of their life to death.
Käimeni opposimallurik qimmitsin qokiaga tuvinyuraarsimagaruarpa.
Juidiu ataatana taqinmigit unanak ilanun nunaqartuta taitsuuqukiayangaarugili walwaunangal atausumaqukertimigigaruartuni tuqumikkaruartuni taina qimmaksiuaraagiunutatoonuga marittaina puut Qikiqtani Qikiqtani.
The Mountie who was there in 1966 wrote in his report that he had shot 250 dogs that year. He alone. People were devastated.
Vi kamangani tiluti tusakavio khanu ipinian mga pekhanu.
Saya malah kokok magu pada isu makan rak sama yunga. Cuma kayak aku tinggal jak tu ninga kokok siapa. Kisah mencolok tidak kaya isu mai kami nga.
Kawi vale ali tena kin ulavang ali kawi malau semangin nama suma kiaman tena ili pale ali kita suma khasiri ya vale ali.
Piyak tahu nasam ni kungundo, kami kijau nasam ni kungundo. Isu makali yak sama kalau isu makali yak sama yung ada kena kokok tahu asal tahu pada isu kaya yak sama.
1964 ngulak tilogo upeng ngasakut. Qikiqtani larsima mimman qangatasiumi atausiliulluni palaisikko qangatasiu uqa youluta palaisimu uqa yoyussiarlortugo hallunoyaqunnalanguittugu kisiani qokiayoqarvalulangman kappeasularsima yugu taisima naqatanguttigiitigu taannalo anaanagiya Pakatituagallote. Asilla qokianginnarpalumma qimmiiluikkuat sarsauvattu aannarpaluttu nillerpalut ittuamman paakkuta unnattorsuukkut qimmimminnialawi Qimmimminnialawi takkuyaarukka tuqqungahuqtavaalawi ataatama taakkuanunaqatitta qimmimminnialawi taissimani aannilahuqsimavunga aanniaqutigiinnarakku akkunni aanniaqutigiillu Palisi isirilluni uqaariartortu qokiusiartuni ikkuagu qimmi ipingaartu illutta ataanimmat illuusummakku nualaarmita qokianearmagin qatanguttigiitigu illuusermi nuang alilaarsimammi qokianearma palisi kappiasussinalaaqillutta taima qokialaartillugununagiyattuni asvillanuangallutta qokiavaluttu illutta ataanu qimmiqulunni kappiaginnaajaqtaalugi qattalilaarsimallugi palisikku Pisimainartugu qokiagunnarningissaqusiugama taanayaqqaamagiinnaqattarsimayaqa
Ugiaqtauleqsipik.
Kisinuli police me Qimmiq Qimmiq ulli ilmasulami tokeruming illutatanitut ana sila mituli.
Come here. Come here. Come here. Come on. Come on. Get out. Qimmiqta luulungali palasikkunni palaqsamangattu taima atausa tainna Qimmiq atausa tainna piyatuagallugu Qimmiqqatunilaarsamajaqkalaimu laimikki kakkimma nuliaqi qigittaqaaliaqaarortillugi Qimmiqqatunilaarsamagakki Qimmiqi sukkuuluaqallugi nalligillugi taavungaqasungusummata qigittaqluama tainna atausa salliaqtuni atausammi arnaluqaulluni kinguvaaliuqunnanga saranguartunga silatittinni qukeaqqalattaavami tusalaarsumaga ungasippaluquni sunaaqapalisikkuanga yuqqaangan taissuminga qimmiliuqtissatuattiaqalertanni qukersilaarsimamma tainnalu qitunganga arnaluqaugani angutiulluni kinguvaaliuqunnagani ajonnarsikallararsimagu qimmeqannayawaaqani
This is where our dogs were slaughtered on the bay. We came down and it seemed the whole population was here, leading their dogs to their death, leading their dogs on a leash for the slaughter. Even the children came along with their assigned dogs. That was how it happened.
So we have no choice, we have to kill the dogs.
I don't remember if I had all my dogs slaughtered. Probably none survived. Although I had tried to resist earlier, they had said it was better to kill the dogs before the dogs turned on humans, as they had been attacking people in other villages. That was the excuse for the slaughter.
My name is Matimune Michael, and I used to have the number with E71454. Sila 13 udah kama. Atatagalo si Pangnirtung tilluno. Qukqtali khayrok sumama ilago apikillune. Nunaraqalahan naqpa. Sanegu ulang ayutsaulusi. Asulas aulakanno tana palisi huki umilus sakpo hautialumelu pu kamalu tatatto. Sekhalak siuti siuti. Ukhahujitsune. Ang yukhangay ukhautinaqasiu. Ukhautinaqay ang yukhanga. Qimmisi tukhogaqali.
Matukku atatagi tikilaaqsimayu qimmini qapeegiartorneqarsutik taaqqutuutsiangutilluta taikkoilavut nunaqqatigigasuartavut taunaniittortahangitillugit taana soqosiarsakkoqautialummi kibitsigasvaqqaulugaluaru kibitsigunnaqaungatto qanumiluganaluamu angiqhaangunginnama атаатагахаангерсимаваарсималлунга пигеэкканерпахангиннама хануилилаусимангиттунгалу хануилиннериарлуунни иққаамангиттунга маликаттакаинналаорсимагама химмини тухуқаттартуни хавилилаорсимажунга
Kingullerpaanganni qimmisigama qanimut tukuluaappisaqaleqsiummu iseqsamittu
Uvuuna hokkilauksimana tautulauksimadaqa uvuuna ammartu tappani uvuuna matumu timmikaageesimma uvuuna amdulauksimadamu matuunalaanauqeartu aumitingilaqilauksimadamu taana puikoqulmangittapa takumnilauqsimangitta aumitingaasaqalauqsimangittaqataima tappanahuqarsimma
Akekukkuagijulaakukka pissutsutiasivartu qimmiqaqunniiratta
Eminnisana
Tukautikamaluatiunakke
Iya, temang
anongli nei nandiani naluruksimajuma nandiani qattava theleulangavanga palisikkunni ouna hokkiasimaju nallia qattava theleugathoernaguma nallia qattava thelearegadaqqaga apekkutiga tamanna hokkialaortulunni upalunni palisikkunallia
Okay, so, just checking in. I realized that was pretty brutal. Hope you're doing okay. And again, these are clips pulled from the two documentaries that I mentioned earlier, Echo of the Last Howl and Qimmiq, A Clash of Two Truths. I thought about narrating that part myself, but I wanted to hammer home the anguish of the dog slaughter, and talking about it in such graphic detail myself seemed really exploitative, so I opted to keep that section to clips of people who actually witnessed it. So we watched that all at once, and now we can unpack it. Around the time of the big change in the Arctic, from the 1950s to the 1960s, the number of sled dogs in the region went from many thousand to just a few hundred. Across Canada, laws at the provincial and territorial level had long been in place to protect dogs from random or unjustified harm, and to protect people and their animals from dangerous or diseased dogs. The Ordinance Respecting Dogs was one such law, and it was enacted without information or advice from Inuit and with little understanding of traditional practices in Inuit Nunangat. All Inuit felt its impact. The ordinance was modeled on southern Canadian laws. It was first introduced in 1928, thoroughly revised in 1949, and has remained in force with amendments ever since. The new law made it illegal for dogs to run loose in prescribed areas. Dog owners who violated the ordinance could be prosecuted and fined up to $25 or jailed for up to 30 days. The dog ordinance also outlined that dog officers were legally responsible for inoculating dogs against diseases and keeping them healthy. Epidemics of canine disease did happen in the Arctic and could devastate communities. In Pangnirtung in 1961, a distemper outbreak killed all the dogs in the small community. Government agents arranged for more dogs to be flown in from neighboring communities. However, these dogs also fell ill and died as well.
There was an outbreak of distemper that killed all the dogs. The Minister of Northern Affairs, Walter Dinsdale, decided to pay a visit to the north. So we chartered this small aircraft and flew into Pangnirtung and arrived there to discover that all the dogs were dead. And this was a hell of a shock, of course, to everybody. So Walter Dinsdale said to me, we better get some dogs for these people, because they had nothing. I mean, they had no skidoos, no bloody dogs, nothing. So he said, can you find some dogs? So I ran around and called and checked around and found that there were a lot of dogs in Fort Qimmiq, Qikiqtani. So he said, well, go and get some. So I was given authority to charter a DC-3, and we flew down to Fort Qimmiq and picked up, I bought 50 dogs. And flew straight back to Pang, landed on the ice, because it was, it's ease on this DC-3. And so the 50 dogs arrived, and people were able to get out on the land. But not for long, because these dogs fell foul of distemper, and they died. So I went and got another load, and the same thing happened to them.
Officials worried about mass starvation among Inuit with no dogs around, as it would greatly impact their ability to hunt for food in the winter. So the government was definitely aware of the importance of Qimmiq for Inuit survival. However, there was another kind of epidemic going on as well. This one at the hands of the police. So back to the dog ordinance. Sorry if parts of this video feel like I'm jumping around a lot. The story is pretty So, the ordinance respecting dogs, or the dog ordinance, was supposed to help protect local populations in the Arctic against the threat of sick or dangerous dogs roaming in settlements. The ordinance was updated to give all RCMP in these communities in the Arctic the authority to destroy dogs for eligible reasons. RCMP could enforce owners to tie up their dogs, and they could kill starving or diseased dogs on the spot. The RCMP had the sole authority to decide if a dog presented a danger or not. You can probably see where this is going. So technically, if a dog was untied and roaming around, it could be considered dangerous and killed. Inuit leader Paul Quassa of Igloolik states, the RCMP said that the dogs had distemper or rabies or some kind of sickness, but they weren't sick at all. The community was growing, but the dogs weren't everywhere. The dogs were in one place. Perhaps the RCMP constables were scared of them, and they slaughtered them. Sometimes they didn't even tell the owners. And like we discussed earlier, RCMP were inconsistent in their enforcement of laws, with the dog ordinance being no exception. Enforcement was often the result of the conditions of a time and place, at the inclination of specific officers. In some cases, only a single Qimmiq would be shot. In other cases, an entire dog team. Inuit found the RCMP arguments for shooting dogs to be unconvincing, especially since Inuit had lived with dogs peacefully for thousands of years. Some Inuit thought that the dogs were being killed to reduce people's mobility and force them to leave the land and live year-round in settlements under the control of officials. If this all sounds pretty muddled, it's because it is. It's only in the last couple of decades that people have been piecing together what happened. We only have the Inuit testimony from the documentaries that you saw earlier because Inuit organizations, like the Qikiqtani Inuit Association, who also wrote all the great reports I used in my research, and the Massacre Corporation. These organizations have conducted inquiries, interviews, and hearings to try and understand what happened to the dogs. The Qikiqtani Inuit Association in particular created the Dog Slaughter and Relocation Committee to look more closely into the issue. In their investigation, they focused on not only what happened to the dogs, but the context and what made the dog killings possible. It had been estimated that about 20,000 dogs were killed by RCMP between 1950 and 1975, and like we saw in the testimonies, specifically with the case of Maddo, these inquiries also revealed that it was not just RCMP officers that shot the dogs, but also Inuit they appointed to do so, or ordered to do so, on their behalf. Accounts from Inuit say that the RCMP claimed that the dogs were attacking and mauling people in other communities, so they had to be shot here because they were dangerous.
We were told that they attacked and mauled people. That's why they were being shot. But in the earlier days, before the Hadlunat arrived, when a dog attacked a person, it was killed instantly because that was an unspoken rule of the Inuit. What really happened to us was that fine, healthy dogs were being killed for no apparent or logical reason. That was really distressing to me. Not just for me, but for a lot of other men. Because of that, our livelihood has been ruined and wasted. They said the dogs were ferocious. They didn't want the dogs mauling and killing people. Those were the reasons given. Those reasons are similar to the firearms safety program in force now. The firearms safety rules have reminded me of the reasons given for the dog slaughter. But I've been trying to remember when a dog had actually killed a person, and I've come up blank. Killed by a dog? Never heard of it. But I remember only one incident in Pangnirtung, later after Inuit from the Qikiqtani area moved to our camp. I remember only one person being attacked and killed by dogs. But it cannot convince me that the dogs are a menace to society. I used to sleep in between my dogs and was never afraid of them. I didn't agree with the slaughter because I knew my dogs were my means of livelihood and I could travel long distances using the dog team. When they said that the dogs were murderers, I didn't believe it. I believe instead that they supported the survival of people, especially before the arrival of the Caucasians. If they didn't have dogs, the Inuit population would have died off instead of increasing.
So, what does the RCMP say in response to all this? Kevin Vickers, Chief Sergeant-at-Arms of the RCMP, contradicted the accusations made by the Inuit organizations and stated that the RCMP never enforced a policy meant to systematically slaughter Inuit dogs. He stated that the RCMP did kill some dogs, but only when they were sick or constituted a real hazard for the inhabitants of the communities. Vickers also seized the opportunity to point out the fact that the RCMP vaccinated hundreds of dogs, that it even gave some food to the Inuit so that they could feed their dogs, and that it even occasionally gave them healthy dogs. Vickers added that the elders who recount these horrifying stories nowadays were very young at the time, and that they probably remember much more the pain experienced by their families than the events as such. A Clash of Two Truths also interviews some retired RCMP who had postings in the Arctic during the time period in question.
My name is Julie Sengui. I'm from Clyde River. Welcome to this session. If you were to tell the commission exactly how you feel about this, what will you say?
When the news came out in the newspapers, headlines right across the land, it just said that Mounties in the north are accused of slaughtering 20,000 Inuit sled dogs. Mm-hmm. Well, that's a kind of like a blanket over everybody that was there.
These men spent the best years of their lives in the north. The way they see it, they're innocent until proven guilty.
When I hear about the accusations of us slaughtering of dogs, it really hurts me because that's not the way we operate. We may have had the odd person up there from time to time that kicked over the rails. He didn't do his job. Those guys didn't come back north when they went out. They served their time maybe, or maybe just part of it, and we weeded them out.
In the Western Arctic, we used to shoot dogs if they had distemper or were wild or loose or something. But it was never the intention that people were going to be forced off the land by shooting the dogs. I never saw that written anywhere.
To say that there was a policy by the force to go out and shoot the dogs, to make the people move into town, to go to school, is absolutely fabrication or misunderstanding, miscommunication.
I've never heard of this ever happening to anywhere that I was and with anybody that I knew. And that's all I can do, But I'm under the blanket because I've been accused as being in the north in that time, so therefore I'm one of the ones that slaughtered all these dogs. And I object to that. I really do. I don't want to go to my grave with that on my record.
That just did not happen at that time or during any of my time in Lake Harbor, Qimmiq. It's incredible, and I mean, I just can't believe it. I mean, the guy appears to be very honest. I can't doubt that, but I just, you know, and all the members I've known up there, I can't imagine somebody giving a child a gun and telling him to go shoot dogs. It just, I'd never heard of that before. I'm kind of astounded by the story, and I hope that we can get to the bottom of it.
Okay, so let's back up a bit. There were a range of RCMP officers. We've already talked about that. Some were more respectful than others. Not all police were bad, blah, 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 blah. But no one is accusing all cops of doing this. I think it's reasonable to say I personally did not shoot dogs. Like, if you didn't shoot the dogs, you can say so, that's fine. But to outright claim that you didn't do it, therefore no one you know did it, at the very least we can say that memories are clashing here.
There's the truth and the truth.
Terry Odla of the Qikiqtani Inuit Association says, "It'd be a sad day when I have to depend on the RCMP for my history. I have my elders for that." This documentary also had a section interviewing Bryan Pearson, the former mayor of Iqaluit. We saw a clip of him earlier talking about the distemper outbreak. And boy oh boy, I really don't like this guy. So for some context, the lady is Joelle Mike, a youth activist in Iqaluit. We saw clips of her earlier interviewing her grandfather Jamesy, who witnessed the dog slaughter. I'll just let you watch this part.
Went around deliberately destroying dogs to make sure that people couldn't get out on them. I mean, I've never heard such crap in my life.
We talked to one elder and they said that she...
Where was this?
In Apex.
Uh-huh.
And we were told that their dogs were tied up on their sled, ready to go that evening. And the police or whoever was in charge of killing the dogs shot the dogs while they were tied up onto the sled.
Absolutely untrue. Total fabrication.
Why do you think they're saying that?
Well, I was here. I've been here 50 years. I know the Mount. I know every one of the Mounties. I knew all of these people that had dog teams. And to say that somebody would come along and deliberately shoot their bloody dogs tied up on a dog team is utter crap.
Notice he didn't answer the question.
But why do you think these elders are telling people that?
They're dreaming. It's ridiculous.
So his rebuttals to this are, it's absolutely untrue, and it's a total fabrication. When asked why the elders would claim these things, he said, because they are dreaming. Anyways, he says some more stuff. He does talk about a dog attack.
A lady that worked in the rehabilitation center, her name was Paulette Anna Rudluck, and she lived here with her son, beautiful boy, and we found him dead at the bottom of the Apex Hill, and he'd been devoured, partially devoured by dogs. And so it became a big problem. We had council meeting after council meeting after council meeting. Tie up your bloody dogs. Tie up your dogs. Yeah, okay, sure. Well, they wouldn't tie them up. One day we had to go and round up. There were so many dogs after this killing. They were everywhere. They were under buildings. They were dangerous. They would attack people on the street. city bylaw officers have killed more dogs in the north than any Mountie ever. Every community, the first and only bylaw officer they ever hired was always the dog catcher, always.
I'm not dismissing this. Even some Inuit that were interviewed said that while very rare, dog maulings did happen sometimes. Perhaps there is a discussion to be had that forcing dogs that are used to a nomadic lifestyle into settled communities is a bad idea. Perhaps that could lead to an increase in attacks. But in my research, it really felt the RCMP were not interested in having that particular discussion. The stuff that I found from the RCMP end, they did a weird mix of either denying that the dogs were shot at all, but then they would concede that the dogs were shot, but only if they were diseased or dangerous. But then they would backtrack on that too and say, well, if they weren't tied up, then they would get shot because they would be dangerous. So it was really messy.
Inuit tell stories, white people write papers. Frank Tester has hundreds of documents about the dogs. But even if something is on paper, doesn't mean it's true.
I don't claim that the archival records tell everything, and I don't even claim that they tell the truth. They definitely don't. What they do is they give the perception, they give some idea of how the non-Inuit authorities, whether it's the RCMP or social workers or nurses or doctors or, whoever, fill in the blank, it's their perception of what was going on. It's their record of what was going on.
Anyway, back to Bryan. His vibe was off, so I went on a little detour and I Googled him. And he died in 2016, and he has one of the weirdest obituaries that I've ever read. He was mayor of Iqaluit, which is the capital of Nunavut, in the 1980s. He is described as a tenacious, irrepressible, and sometimes infuriating presence in the life of the Eastern Arctic for 60 unforgettable years. He was known to Inuit as Sedluk or Saluk, the skinny one. He brought flamboyant style and entrepreneurial panache to his work. He served as Iqaluit's only undertaker for many years, operating a hearse. He was born in Liverpool, England, and it said Pearson, to say the least, did not always endear himself to others. Keep in mind, this is in the man's obituary. He could have allegedly maybe been involved in election fraud. In 1986, Pearson's secretarial manager, Joe Rosado, was convicted of forging ballots marked with votes for Pearson. Pearson was never convicted for anything about this, but he never served in office again. So anyway, I was having fun with the whole whimsy of this obit until the end of it when it discussed his personal life. His personal life was often the subject of local rumor and speculation, and he never married and was never seen pursuing romantic relationships with either men or women. In 1997, a judge found Pearson not guilty on a single count of sexual assault following a trial at the Territorial Court of the Northwest Territories. That charge arose from an allegation that in 1983, at his home in Iqaluit, Pearson sexually assaulted a 15-year-old boy. Oh my god. Okay, back to what the hell happened with the dogs. In March 2005, the House of Commons Standing Committee on Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development heard witnesses describe the killing of sled dogs in Nunavut and the Baffin region between 1950 and 1970. These incidents, which became known as the dog slaughter, occurred during the same period as the resettlement of Inuit into a few central communities. After much pressure from the QTC and Makivik, as well as Inuit communities in general, the federal government ordered the RCMP to conduct an internal inquiry in 2005, after 2 days of hearings in the House of Commons. The Standing Committee called for a public inquiry by a Superior Court judge to get to the bottom of the matter. The Government of Canada did not set up the requested inquiry. Instead, it asked the RCMP to conduct a comprehensive review of its actions regarding sled dogs in the North between 1950 and 1970. The force presented a brief report later in 2005, followed by a 26-page final report titled The RCMP and the Inuit Sled Dogs, Nunavut and Northern Quebec, 1950 to 1970, to the new government in 2006. They produced a much longer compilation of evidence and commentary later the same year, a 775-page document. In the report, the RCMP states that they went through 42,000 pages of historical documents from the RCMP and other government departments. They also mention accessing an Inuit oral history database compiled by the Inuit Research Center. And their conclusion was that they did not uncover any evidence to support allegations of an organized mass slaughter. A quote from the conclusion of the inquiry as follows. The destruction of Inuit sled dogs and other dogs was undertaken by RCMP members for public health and safety reasons, in accordance with the law, to contain canine epidemics and at times at the request of the dog's owners. There was a startling drop in Inuit sled dog populations, particularly during the 1960s. This decline can be associated with a number of factors, including devastating canine epidemics, the collapse of the fur trade, the introduction of the snowmobile. I have a whole section on snowmobiles later on. The migration of the Inuit people into settlements, and their participation in the market economy rather than living on the land. So the RCMP found that there was no evidence of a government policy to systematically eliminate sled dogs, so there was no conspiracy to shoot dogs. They did concede that the RCMP destroyed some dogs because they were disease-ridden, hungry, dangerous, or the number of dogs was too high. That last one, that was a new reason that I didn't see come up anywhere else. So the RCMP exonerated their own officers of criminal and administrative wrongdoing in the matter of killing Inuit sled dogs, and by extension, exonerating the federal government. As the QTC notes, and they have a lot of notes, the report focused on RCMP behavior from a forensic rather than historical perspective, without examining the cultural practices and rules of Inuit at the time. It focused on whether particular actions by RCMP members were sanctioned by legislation, and concluded that the killings were legal. They also looked for, but did not find, evidence that might show the actions were directed toward forcing Inuit off the land into settlements. Okay, so we don't have evidence of an organized, top-down government conspiracy to shoot all the dogs in the Arctic. But what about the law being abused, applied in bad faith by individual RCMP officers? Perhaps, when coercing Inuit into settlements by the other means we talked about, through schooling, social assistance, promises of a better life, the RCMP had no idea how to deal with the dogs coming along too.
What we have are different perceptions and different accounts of what was going on, and most importantly, the question why. So, for example, I've heard the claim that the RCMP had a conscious policy of shooting dogs in order to trap people in settlements. I've listened to this, I've thought about it, and I have to be honest and say that I've never seen a document which makes this claim or which instructs the RCMP to behave in this way. And it's also counterintuitive because I have all kinds of other documents instructing the RCMP to chase people out of town to make sure that they were not becoming, quote, dependent, that they were out in their camps and making a living, and that they were hunting and trapping and trading furs with the Hudson's Bay Company.
Let's backtrack to the problems with the dog ordinance in the first place. First of all, it's a pretty vague law. Essentially, if the police perceived a dog to be a danger, it made it legal for them to shoot it. I don't know about you, but I can't think of any situation where a cop might abuse that power.
Stupid! Let that be a lesson to the rest of you, nuts!
The QTC acknowledges that perhaps white people living in the Arctic communities were not used to Qimmiq roaming around the way Inuit were used to them, and they were simply more at risk of the dogs because they didn't know how to interact with them. And again, these communities were growing, resulting in new and more unfamiliar people for the Qimmiq. I couldn't find any stats on dog attacks in the Arctic, but from what I've read, they seem pretty rare, especially during this time period. I did find a few statements saying that dogs in communities were more of a danger to property than to people, and that the attacks that did happen mostly happened to non-Inuit people. And again, I'm not suggesting that we dismiss dog attacks in Arctic communities, but I am suggesting that the solution is perhaps not for the police to shoot them all. Inuit have lived alongside Qimmiq for thousands of years peacefully, so something isn't adding up. The QTC suggested that the public safety argument was often used to justify shooting dogs more for what they might do in the future than what they were actually doing at the time. Even from a standpoint of a potentially diseased dog, the RCMP had a tendency to shoot dogs without much of a reasonable suspicion that they had a serious or contagious disease warranting this extreme response. So moving on to another requirement of the dog ordinance, that the dogs had to be tied up. Like we discussed earlier, the RCMP could interpret the ordinance to suggest that an untied dog was dangerous and therefore could be shot, whether they actually presented a danger or not. And I also would like to point out that having dogs tied up all the time is not a trivial thing for Qimmiq. You'll remember from earlier that this type of dog needs constant exercise. Tying them up actually weakened them. This is why they were traditionally allowed to run loose when they were not harnessed up and working. Inuit depended on having healthy and strong dogs for hunting and transportation. Even when Inuit did tie up their dogs, they also frequently escaped by chewing through their harnesses or by pulling at weak chains.
Qimmiq
Simon Edlout states, "The puppies were not allowed to be tied up because of the muscles in their legs. If you tie them up, they would become very weak. According to the way Inuit used to feel, they would never tie up dogs in the camp. They need the exercise. No puppies were ever to be tied up. That was the law of the Inuit. We get new laws from the federal government, and because it doesn't make any sense, we don't agree with it, but we have to follow it." By 2006, after the Conservative Party came into power in Ottawa and the RCMP submitted the report of their own internal investigation, the QIA and Qikiqtani knew that the federal government would not name a judge or pay for an inquiry that would probe the fate of Inuit dogs in eastern Arctic communities in the 1950s and 1960s. Somehow, both Inuit organizations had not been able to convince the federal government of the importance and meaning of these claims for them and their constituents. So Inuit launched their own investigation. Between 2007 and 2010, the QIA visited every community in the Baffin region, gathering oral testimony to supplement archival research. They established their own inquiry, the Qikiqtani Truth Commission, whose reports and findings were crucial to research on this topic. The Truth Commission was independent of the government, with a broader mandate to study the whole range of government and Inuit relations during this turbulent period.
It was established and paid for by the Inuit because the Canadian government wants nothing to do with the issue, and the RCMP denies any wrongdoing.
From what I can tell, their methodology was much more complete and inclusive than that of the RCMP internal inquiry. The QTC looks far beyond the technical legality of the dog deaths and into the impact of socio-economic trends and ill-formed government policies and practices. It integrates Inuit concepts of justice into its analysis of the responses of Inuit to dog killings and other actions of RCMP officers. In addition to extensive archival research and listening to approximately 350 individuals, including Inuit, retired RCMP, government staff, scholars, and politicians, the QTC benefited from access to RCMP records, including documents and administrative correspondence gathered by the RCMP for its own report. Here are some excerpts from the final QTC report findings summary. Quote, "One of the duties police accepted in the new state of affairs was destroying sled dogs, which had become quite numerous in the settlements. There were some Inuit who were less able to care for them and control them in traditional ways, because the practice of keeping dogs loose was riskier in the much larger settlements of people. Under pressure from non-Inuit, hundreds, perhaps thousands of Inuit sled dogs were killed from the mid-1950s onwards, despite a confusingly contrary policy of having the police immunize dogs against disease and even import dogs to replace others lost in a canine epidemic. While the report carefully noted periods or episodes in which the RCMP were dedicated to the cause of preserving the traditional Inuit semi-nomadic culture, including the use of dogs, its analysis sidestepped the impacts of the killings on Inuit at the same time and since. It argued effectively that RCMP did not want to kill dogs, and that the killings were never part of a conspiracy with the explicit motive of forcing Inuit to stop hunting and live in permanent settlements. The RCMP Sled Dogs report acknowledged that RCMP members and other persons in authority in the 1950s and 1960s killed hundreds and perhaps thousands of dogs, but it ignores Inuit knowledge and perspectives on these killings. Because the RCMP was in no position to conduct an independent inquiry, the review team did not receive the full trust and cooperation of most Inuit who lived through the 1950s and 1960s. The RCMP Sled Dogs report reads as an exercise by the force to sustain or create a positive collective memory of the RCMP experience in the region, with a nostalgic focus on the specific duties and circumstances of the 1950s and 1960s. End quote. You can find these thematic reports on the QTC website for free. You can also find a database of full interview videos with Inuit in the region as well on the website. Again, in my opinion as a researcher, this was a much more robust and in-depth inquiry than that conducted by the RCMP. Each report begins with this acknowledgement by President J. Okali Qikiqtani. On a personal level, this is for the grandmother I never knew, because she died in a sanatorium in Hamilton. This is for my grandchildren, so that they can understand what our family has experienced. And it is also for the young people of Canada, so that they will also understand our story. Inuit communities experience a higher prevalence of social issues than the general Canadian population. Food insecurity rates among Inuit communities are 6 times higher than the Canadian national average. Housing insecurity is also a major issue in these communities, with overcrowding occurring at a much higher rate than the Canadian national average, and dangerous conditions such as mold growth also being a major issue. These and additional concerns, such as higher rates of substance issues and poverty, all stem from the intergenerational impact of colonialism, which includes the Inuit sled dog slaughter. When you start looking into social issues, their causes, and their impact, you'll notice that everything is connected. So I am not blaming all of these things solely on the dog slaughter, but merely pointing out that it did make up a key piece of the colonialism puzzle that resulted in the issues that we see today. The sled dog slaughter during the 1950s and 60s coincided with a lot of major changes in Inuit communities. One of these changes was the introduction of the snowmobile, or skidoo, in the Canadian Arctic. According to Inuit, this new mode of transportation had both pros and cons with respect to its impact on Inuit life and culture.
It's probably one of the most interesting stories in the world. Inuit who are living in hunting camps as a hunting culture come into settlements. And so you have a phenomenal culture and social change taking place in a very short period of time. And what's really interesting is at the same time, Bombardier in 1960 patents the autoboggin, or the skidoo. What happens is the use of skidoos in the Baffin region, in fact in the entire Arctic, increases steadily throughout the 1960s.
The dogs became redundant over the Inuits' adoption of the skidoo as their transportation. And the benefit of the skidoo was that the trappers, the hunters, could go out, spend the whole day out there at the trap line or hunting, and be back in at their home in Lake Harbor at night. Under the old system with the dogs, they would go out and spend days out there and then come back.
It totally changed the way people hunted and traveled, and the flexibility that it gave you, the distances you could cover.
My father got his own snowmobile that he had to fix when it broke down, and it took all day. He had to buy expensive parts. I felt sorry for him.
I started raising dogs again, remembering my father's advice. He used to say, "Don't buy the snowmobile. Continue with the dog team." Those words kept coming back to me, and I couldn't forget them. His words of wisdom, saying the snowmobile breaks down, and the driver could freeze to death out on the land. Don't use them. But I paid no attention at the time, just seeing how far and fast I could go on the snowmobile. Those machines were expensive, and the price keeps going up. It was our downfall. They do damage no matter what. Every type of transportation does damage. A lot of people have died using the snowmobile. The dogs have mauled and killed people, but far less than the snowmobile. The snowmobile has killed many people, maimed many people. The dogs have killed a lot less. The damage done by the dogs was overblown, but nothing has been said or done about the damage done by the snowmobile. That's the part I really don't like. The dogs have done a lot less damage to humans, and people complain about them for the few incidents. But they don't go on and on about the damages done to humans caused by the snowmobile. That's the part I really don't like. Nobody is doing anything about removing the snowmobile, and probably nobody will.
Another major change experienced by Inuit communities at this time was the introduction of alcohol, which, when combined with everything else going on at the time, tended to exacerbate these issues.
After the slaughter, social problems started. They had too much time to think, and the future didn't look promising. That was the turning point of our lifestyle into degradation. The art of making homebrew had been in existence before the slaughter. The abuse of homebrew started after, and we began seeing inebriated people.
After the slaughter, there were a lot of drunks. I remember a lot of drunken people, and it terrified me. There was no law and order in our village. There seemed to be no one in charge. Everything was going crazy. There was chaos. Drunk people everywhere, fighting, angry. The fights were horrible. There was wife swapping. That isn't the way to live. All these happenings terrified us.
No one has ever apologized to me, not even once. I don't remember anything resembling an apology. "I'm sorry your dogs were killed" is a phrase I have never heard. Nothing was ever given to me as a replacement. I'm telling it like it is. It affected the man a lot, stripping him of his ability, his hunting prowess, and his authority. It deprived the family members of going along for the hunting adventure. It deprived the offspring of learning how to drive the dog team, how to learn survival skills. The very core of Inuit life was abolished by the slaughter. It deeply affected a lot of people, not just the man, but the whole family.
Gaba matukakkunin inusillattange Inuit asiwasaksutin gaba matukakkut pikuyakutiming niktaw ng ngaktuarong mi kadluna nunangan ng ngaktuarong mi uwatin no kahit tinasuklutin tan makiribok taba gaba matukakku siya kilaktun uwang akawi mayatukangan nagpitakakun isuin na kurano isayaw saong araw milukisiyane utirtin na surang milukisiyane utirlune ato kasigunak siya kadlunang uktitaw na sulat taksi mabunga nairoak sungaro kadlunang uguma nuyak karo adjiging itsunigin uwinigaro adjiging itsuniyo kadlunang uktitaw na sukuroak sunga inuugama itiyak taw ni kuyunga.
This is the legacy of colonialism. traditional culture and knowledge of dog sledding, as well as the practical and spiritual importance it played in gathering country food and being out on the land, was devastated by the dog slaughter. Once this knowledge is lost, it can be all but impossible to get back.
I've always wanted to work with them just because, they need, it's not supposed to be a jail for them, it's supposed to be a place for improvement. We have kids here that we see that sometimes we have to kick them out because they have problems with themselves and they're continuously bringing it back here, and we know it comes from the home, and we might even kind of know the history of the parents, and it's not their fault. Obviously it's more common in Inuit because of the social problems that we have from everything that happened to Inuit, from the dog slaughter to the relocations to the E numbers and the residential schools. It's obvious a lot of those people are really angered and frustrated, and it might be the reason why some of these kids have parents that are sometimes, can't just always be parents because of so much hurt.
One thing I did want to delve into a little more was the prevalence of dog attacks in recent times in Arctic communities. This was because in a lot of the news articles that I consulted about sled dogs, a lot of the comments alluded to a stray dogs issue existing in many Arctic communities today.
And space in shelters is very limited. The overpopulation stems from a lack of access to resources, like vets who can run mobile spay and neuter clinics in remote places.
Nunatsiaq News is a regional newspaper, an online news source that records events within Nunavik and Nunavik. Most of the comments on Nunatsiaq news articles appear to be from residents of this region, although of course I can't verify this. I haven't done any systemic analysis into this issue, but from some Google research into local news articles in the past few years, there does seem to be a problem with roaming stray dogs in many northern communities that has resulted in violent and sometimes lethal attacks in the past decade or so. Again, I have no data suggesting how often that these attacks happen, or if they are any more prevalent in Arctic communities than dog attacks that occur in the general Canadian population. Although Inuit testimony, particularly in Echo of the Last Howl, does state that dog attacks are rare, remember, this documentary was released in 2005, and it does appear that perhaps things have changed since then. I have found 2 incidents reported of dog attacks in the past year, and remember, these are just those that have been reported in a public news source. Perhaps it's because it's easier to find out information and current events nowadays. Or perhaps this is because communities are getting bigger, and there are more incidents because there are more people. But who can say without more research into the area? I can say that a lot of commenters mention anecdotally the issue of stray and neglected dogs in their own communities, so it would be interesting to do some kind of analysis on this topic. Even on positive news stories about the revitalization of dog sledding, which we will discuss in the final section of this video, there are some exasperated commenters upset that dog teams are being encouraged when there are so many dogs that are not being cared for. From my feeling based on reading all of this, and also my research into social issues existing in many Inuit communities today, I get the feeling that aggressive stray dogs are not a symptom of traditional sled dog practices, but of these major social issues. For one thing, stray dogs are also a problem in not only Arctic Inuit communities, but other northern remote communities in Canada, such as those in the Northwest Territories, northern Saskatchewan, northern Manitoba, and northern Ontario. Some communities are often fly-in only, with roaming packs of dogs having a limited means of getting in or out. Again, it seems like this dog issue could be a symptom of major social issues in these communities. If people aren't doing well, it's hard to care for animals, so strays happen. They make more strays, and they get hungry. Again, I can't find much research in this area. This is conjecture on my part. One wonders if the RCMP didn't shoot all those dogs in the 50s and 60s, and the traditional way of life of Inuit was better preserved, we wouldn't see all these social issues in Inuit communities today, including roaming there has also been more government acknowledgement of their own role in the slaughter as well. As a disclaimer, I am not suggesting that a government apology undoes the damage of the impact of colonialism. However, it does show that progress has been made since the initial RCMP sled dog report was released in 2006. In 2011, the Quebec provincial government gave the Qimmiq Corporation $3 million to acknowledge the slaughter of dogs in Nunavut in the 1950s and 60s, and the social issues that the slaughter caused. The Canadian federal government has also given a formal apology in 2019, no doubt in part influenced by the mountain of findings presented by the Qikiqtani Truth Commission. Carolyn Bennett, the then Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs, apologized on behalf of the government for colonial policies and practices in the North, with $20 million offered as part of the apology, and $3 million of this specifically earmarked for dog revitalization efforts. So there has been a government apology and an acknowledgement of the harm of the RCMP sled dog killings, which is definitely a step in the right direction. Some of this dog revitalization money was used by the Qikiqtani Inuit Association to hold a conference in Iqaluit in November of 2023 for Inuit dog sledders to discuss cultural practices and create educational resources for others. The goal was to begin rebuilding and revitalizing this traditional knowledge so it is not lost to future generations. Specifically, encouraging young Inuit to keep sledding alive, sharing the knowledge of how to work and maintain a dog team. There's been some other pretty neat reclamation efforts related to dog sledding as well. The Nunavut Quest Dog Sled Race is a 500-kilometer dog sled race across the Canadian High Arctic, mostly the Baffin Island region. I was reading an article about it by Dustin Patar in the Canadian Geographic. He also included some really great pictures of the event as well. The race promotes building and maintaining a dog team. In the article, Dustin interviews Terry Uyarak, a dog sledder, who discusses how he takes care of his dogs, including feeding them and training them. Terry says that his bond with his sled dogs is no different from that of a typical dog owner who loves their pet and considers them family. In this case, they just live outside, as Qimmiq prefer to do. I also found an article about an Inuk named Devin Manick from Resolute Bay, who has worked really hard to reclaim dog sledding knowledge largely on his own. The article also includes some great pictures and footage. Devin talks about watching videos on YouTube of dog sledders from Greenland and then working on his own to learn how to do it himself. He built his own team from scratch, and he keeps his dogs fed and trained. He says, "I call them my children with teeth," which I thought was pretty great. He also posts pictures and videos of himself and his team on Instagram and TikTok, so I encourage you to look him up and check him out there. And both of these articles are linked in my references in the description below.
Little Mary, promise me never to forget, and in your turn, to tell. There are legacies one could well do without, but like tragic beacons, they guide us, they alert us and warn us. Of this ordeal, maybe you'll learn to resist if you are mystified.
Whew, that was a journey now, was it? I honestly can't believe I'm all done now. I cannot thank you enough for sticking around if you've made it this far. This was definitely a labor of love to research and script and narrate and edit, so I hope that you enjoyed it. I'm just gonna go not edit anymore. I don't know why I decided to make my first YouTube video ever push 2 hours long, but hey, we got through it. Oh, and I'm sorry about all the mic popping noises. I'm working on that. I'm still learning. However, I did edit out most of my loud inhaling breaths, or else my video would have sounded a lot more like this. Anyway, stay tuned for the next one. I'm planning a companion video on the Arctic relocations, which is another harrowing and complicated tale, so if that sounds like something that you're interested in, please remember to subscribe for more. Thanks again, and so long till next time.